I'm Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm not glad to meet you. You'd be better off to be suffering. So hear me sing. I'm Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm not Callicles, although we both seem to do what we please. That he likes pleasure, expanding without measure. But I like solitude, I'm just that kind of dude. Well, hello, I'm Friedrich Nietzsche. You know I'd beat you. You're just a sheep straight from the hood. I'm Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm a creator, you're a creature. I'm a man of power. You know I'd beat you. Okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche and the Good Life, Beyond Good and Evil on the Natural History of Morals. There's Friedrich Nietzsche with his celebrated moustache. Behold my awesome moustache. So Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, was a German philosopher, cultural critic, composer, poet, philologist. Philology is the study of the origin of languages, a Latin and Greek scholar whose work has exerted a profound influence on Western philosophy. Famous for an uncompromising criticism of traditional European morality and religion, which 1844 to 1900, this is European Christianity. I am being very careful here to distinguish this from and try and make you aware that it's just not satisfactory to refer to Christianity as a whole. There's just too many facets of Christianity, both throughout the ages and across the globe. He was a criticism of European morality and religion, as well as of conventional philosophical ideas, social and political pieties. Pieties comes from the word pious, as in to be pious, to be righteous, associated with modernity. So a lot of the ideas of piety, things that are held to be right, such as egalitarianism and charity, so to speak, these were issues that Nietzsche criticised. And we have to be really very careful when we look at Nietzsche, because there's a tendency to think that he is simply dismissing many of these ideas. Often what he's doing is attacking the hypocrisy of the people who advocated these sort of pieties. So his criticism was often of the hypocrisy rather than the ideal. It's very easy to be anti-Nietzsche. I've met a lot of Christians in particular who are anti-Nietzsche because they believe he is anti-Christianity. On closer inspection, Nietzsche's writing often, A, it's hard to deny what he often says, and B, he comes close to advocating sorts of ideals which you find in Jesus' teachings, which seems contradictory given that he's often anti-religion. He became the youngest person to hold the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel in 1869 at the age of 24. He resigned in 1879 due to health problems which plagued him all of his life. I think he suffered from migraine headaches. It's not uncommon to find a lot of the philosophers we study suffering from sort of the ill health that often goes with mental issues. He completed much of his core writing in the following decade. And the age of 44, he suffered a collapse and afterward a complete loss of his mental faculties. He lived his remaining years in the care of his mother until her death in 1897, and then he lived with his sister Elizabeth Forrester Nietzsche, and then he died in 1900. Nietzsche is often, if you type in Nietzsche into Google, probably the first couple of hits are going to include references to Nazi Germany. Now obviously he died in 1900. Nazism or the Nazi Party doesn't arise until a few decades or a little while later. I'm not certain exactly when it arises as a party, but of course the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler is 30s through to 40s. He's associated with Nazism because of a couple of his key ideas, one of them being the will to power and the man of power. These fitted well with the Aryan ideal. And in fact, his sister, Elizabeth, did take his writings into the Nazism. She was pretty certain, I can say, correct in saying that she was a member of the Nazi Party. Nietzsche himself did not hold the views of Nazism. Nietzsche was very good friends, or was friends, with the composer Wagner. Wagner was anti-Semitic, quite anti-Semitic. Nietzsche fell out with Wagner over his anti-Semitism. Nietzsche did not agree with that. So Nietzsche's a lot more complex than a surface reading will give you. You need to look into him a lot deeper. Don't just trust what you find on the internet first couple of hits. Okay? Let's get into the text. So, the text is broken up into a series of sections. Sections 199 is our first section, or section 199 is our first section. The key idea that he's looking at here is the idea of the herd and the herd mentality. And we'll come back to where the herd arises from historically, according to Nietzsche, a bit later on. But at the start of our section, Nietzsche refers to human herds. He gives the following examples: family groups, communities, tribes, nations, states, churches. We have also recognized that a school is in effect a herd. It's a social group. He says that these are made up of very many who obey, compared with very small number who command, and that these herds are the natural inclination of humans. There is a need to obey. Humans have a need to obey. It is innate, and this innate need we then formalize as a conscience. It becomes our conscience telling us you should obey. So it's something that is becoming a should. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. He refers to it as a formal conscience. Taken to its extreme, this need to obey would mean that all humans have this need to obey. That should mean that the people who are left to command also have this need to obey, so they are caught, so to speak. In fact, he argues that the commanders in Europe in his day, and we would say today, suffer from a bad conscience, and in order to command, have to practice a deceit upon themselves. They suffer from a bad conscience. They want to obey, but they are in command. This creates a hypocrisy in them. It makes them feel bad about themselves, so they have to practice a deceit upon themselves. He refers to this as the moral hypocrisy of commanders. The commanders of Europe have a need to obey. So when they command, they suffer from a bad conscience. In order to command without feeling bad, they practice a deceit upon themselves. They pretend, now consciously or unconsciously, that they are not actually commanding, but rather they are simply, and this is his phrase, executors of a more ancient or higher commands. So they either pretend literally pretend, oh, it's not me commanding you what to do, it's the Constitution, it's the religious law, the Ten Commandments, or whichever set of religious laws you want to put forward. Or as I said, we see it in America today, they almost treat their Constitution as a divine document, even though it was a set of ideals and rules and guidelines written by a group of white old men, and has been amended many times. There's a really interesting quirk of the American Constitution, or of the American psyche, that things like you have the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, these are treated as if they are law come down from God, when they are amendments, they are additions to the Constitution. They were changes made. There's a huge debate about the second Constitution, the right to bear arms in America at the moment, gun laws. There is one group of people who believe that, yes, maybe gun laws would stop school shootings and save lives, but we can't change it because it is the Constitution. This is the Second Amendment. This was delivered from high by some sort of strange gun-loving God. Anyway, the point being that the commanders have a need to obey, so to stop themselves feeling bad for commanding, they convince themselves, consciously or unconsciously, that they are not commanding, they are simply passing on the commands that come from a higher realm. Herd virtues. The herd man makes himself to be the only kind of permissible kind of man. Now, Nietzsche disagrees with this, as we'll see later. The herd man glorifies qualities that fit with herd. Tame, peaceful, useful. They claim that herd virtues are public spirit, benevolence, consideration, industriousness, moderation, modesty, forbearance, pity. These are the sorts of things that would be recognised as virtues. And as we see in this picture here, a couple of my little herd pictures. The first one there, you've got all the sheep going over the cliff. Or are they sheep or lemmings? It's lemmings that famously run over cliffs to die, but they're sheep there because sheep are the epitome of herd animal. And got the sheep there saying, wait a minute, something feels wrong. Shut up, you moron, do as you've been told. It's for your own good. And down the bottom, the two sheep talking to each other. Sure, I follow the herd, not out of brainless obedience, mind you, but out of a deep and abiding respect for the concept of community. The concept of community, which would be held to be a herd virtue, public spirit, industrious consideration, working usefulness for the herd. And I think it's a discussion I've had nearly every year. How much can we see this in the Nuremberg defense from the concentration camp guards in the Holocaust, who pleaded that they were simply doing what they were told. They were not following the herd, they were following the herd, but they would argue that they were doing it out of respect for the concept of community, the Nazi community in this case. Following the law out of respect for the concept of community. And there's a famous picture that you've probably seen on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, be this guy, a picture of one guy amongst thousands of people at a Nazi a Nazi march and everyone's saluting and he's the one guy with his arms folded. So, section 201, we can sum this one up by the heading Love of One's Neighbour. Section 201 starts by recognising that it is the idea of utility that underpins the moral value judgments of the herd. Utility, usefulness to the group. The next thing he says is difficult and students often find themselves confused. So I'm going to go through and read this. Just read it through first. This is the quote. The immoral is sought precisely and exclusively in that which seems to imperil the existence of the community. So that which imperils the existence of the community is defined as immoral. So long as that is the case, so long as this is the case, says Nietzsche, there can be no morality of love of one's neighbour. Now, love of one's neighbour, of course, comes from the two great commandments: love the Lord your God, love the neighbour as yourself. This is the key, or one of the two fundamental keys for the Christian summation of Christianity, the summation of Christianity. This is how Jesus himself sums up Christianity, sums up religion. Love God, love your neighbour. It's in the phrase love your neighbour as yourself that all morality rests. Now, the Christianity of Nietzsche's time is based upon, or says it is based upon, this idea, love of one's neighbour. Now here, Nietzsche is not rejecting the idea of love one's neighbour. He is rejecting the hypocrisy of the way that the Christianity of his time justifies their morality based on love of one's neighbour. I'll say that again. He's rejecting the hypocrisy. He says that when Christians of his time say morality arises out of loving one's neighbour, they are being hypocritical. They are lying both to other people and to themselves. It doesn't, according to Nietzsche, morality doesn't arise out of love of one's neighbour, or the morality of his age. Love of one's neighbour is the basis of Christian morality and is seen as the basis of European modern morality. From Nietzsche's point of view, however, we do not act in a moral way because of love of one's neighbour, but because of fear of one's neighbour. So from Nietzsche's point of view, the reason why we feel like we should treat other people a certain way is fear. It is, we are aware that there may be, in a group, there may be people who are stronger than us and could take from us what they wanted. We fear them. So we want to make it the right way of we want to make a morality where people who are stronger cannot hurt us. Now this is basically what Callicles was saying about convention. So here Callicles and Nietzsche sound and are basically saying the same thing. We have to be really careful. Too many students see this first little bit and then go, oh, Callicles and Nietzsche are the same. And it comes up again and again, year after year in exams. Students identifying Callicles and Nietzsche. There are very distinct differences between the two. You need to do well, you need to recognise the similarities and the differences. Here we have a similarity. The herd fear anything that might raise one person above another, my neighbour against me. So they create a set of laws to keep everyone equal. And as I've said, compare Callicles' comments on conventional laws. What happens is ought not, or ought, becomes good and evil. Okay, so these phrases about what ought to be the case become moral phrases. You should recall, you've probably done the is-ought problem as articulated by David Hume, 1711 to 76. And to sum that up, many writers make claims, this is Hume, many writers make claims about what ought to be based on statements about what is. And you should compare this also with the naturalistic fallacy. Naturalistic fallacy, just because something is natural doesn't make it right. Okay, and that was definitely something that we saw with Callicles. Callicles was claiming that in nature, the stronger can take what they want, can dominate and have more, and therefore that's right. The lion can eat the antelope, therefore that is right that the lion eats the antelope. Therefore it is right that the stronger rule the weaker. That's Callicles' mentality. That's sometimes called, or that is called, a naturalistic fallacy. The is-ought problem is very closely tied to it. If something is the case, then it ought to be. So, in a similar sense, Nietzsche recognises how the herd turn their fear of strength in others into a moral code that calls the opposite of these strengths good and the strengths evil. Okay, just make certain you get that. In a similar sense, Nietzsche recognises how the herd turn their fear of strengths, these are the strengths that other people might have, into a moral code. So I'm scared that you're stronger than me. So we create a moral code and we take your strength is being bigger, stronger than me. So we're going to call that strength evil, and we'll take the opposite of that, which is my weakness, and we'll call my weakness good. We'll praise my weakness. They set up the idea that one ought not be superior. This ought not is then judged to be evil. So how does this work? Even if you are stronger, it's not about ought here, but you are stronger than me, you ought not to manifest that strength because of this moral code. And you wanting to obey the moral code are aware that it would be evil to manifest your strength. So you hold back. You don't want to be stronger than me because that would be evil. In fact, not only don't you want to manifest your own strengths, you want to cultivate and manifest the weaknesses that we all praise. So I'm weaker than you. You want to be like that. That's what the moral code tells you is good. Everything that raises the individual above the herd, this is Nietzsche, and makes his neighbour quail is henceforth called evil. The mean and average in desires acquires moral names and honours. And that's an interesting one there, that phrase, the mean and average in desires. That's a great one to be able to compare to Aristotle and the doctrine of the mean. I don't think an Aristotle-Nietzsche comparison question has come up in the last couple of exams I've seen. That would make a really good one. How do Nietzsche and Aristotle feel about the idea of the average or the mean? Be a great question. It's one you should try and be prepared to respond to. So 201 continues, and there's this phrase, extra moral. Nietzsche makes a passing comment about certain practices being, at one time, extra moral. Now think of the prefix ex as indicating outside. Not extra as in more moral, but outside as in exoskeleton. So what he means here when he's saying extra moral is before the herd mentality takes over, there existed a time which was outside or beyond. I've left a D off. Let me just fix my D. And there we go. Or beyond morality. Note, the title of his book is Beyond Good and Evil. For Nietzsche, this time is epitomised by the finest age of Rome. I would suggest there's a certain irony there. I would suggest that actually the Roman age corresponds most correctly to the modern age that we live in now and modernity. But I'm not going to get into a fight with Nietzsche about that. He has a wonderfully big moustache and would probably beat me up. So, for Nietzsche, this time, which was extra moral, outside of morality, existed at the finest age of Rome. Here, Nietzsche is probably practicing what psychologists would call sort of a golden age syndrome. He's referring back to a time which he sees things as being perfect. At this time, and for these people, who he characterises as noble and masters, and there's a little section we have to look at later on which will go into the masters, there is no morality. Morality, on the other hand, is a codification of values into regulations. Thou shalt do this because it is good. Thou shalt not do this because it is evil. In contrast, for the noble person, there's no good or bad, no moral or immoral. There simply is what is. Okay? There simply is what is. What happens is these is get transferred into the language of morality. Now, 203, Nietzsche talks about the collective degeneration of man. For Nietzsche, the movement to a herd mentality, or morality, not mortality. For Nietzsche, the movement to a herd morality, or a morality based on fear, is the type of morality he saw in modern Europe. This type of morality aims to no longer have anything to fear. That is one of the basis of the sort of modern idea that we want to get rid of anything that we might fear. This is how he sees the ideology of what he calls progress, or we know as progress. In section 203, Nietzsche describes democracy, which he refers to as the nonsense of the greatest number, as a form assumed by man in decay. Now, he's not alone in this judgment. Plato identifies, or even just before I get to Plato, I think it was Winston Churchill who referred to democracy as, what was the phrase? He refers to democracy as something like an awful way to run a government, but the best one we have. The best way we have. I'll have to look that up at some stage. Anyway, Plato identifies 5 types of regimes. This is from the Republic book, book 8. Aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. From Plato's point of view, democracy, which was that was the form of government in operation at the time he was in Athens. Democracy is only one step away from tyranny. And again, the greatest, self-proclaimed greatest democracy in the world at the moment is America. and you've only got to look at what's happening there to wonder if Plato was very far off. So Nietzsche sees democracy as a sign that man is in decay. Again, Nietzsche was very interested in philology. He's interested in how language works. And it's a really interesting one to look at democracy, because democracy is the rule of the people, which sounds very positive when we say rule of the people. But it is also, of course, just change the language a little bit, it is mob rule, which we associate with a mob of crazy people chasing Frankenstein, or chasing, to be more historically accurate, think of the mobs who lynched black people in America during the through many years leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. The rule of the people, mob rule. From Nietzsche's quote here, there's a great quote: "The collective degeneration of man, this degeneration and diminutive, becoming smaller, of man to the perfect herd animal, this animalization of man." That's how he refers to the progress and democracy, this animalization of man. And that's a great term for us, again, when you think about exams and the comparison between Nietzsche and, say, Aristotle. Aristotle talks about the distinction between animals and man. And if you remember, it is rationality, the ability to practice rationality. What is happening with the collective degeneration of man, according to Nietzsche? In a sense, it's almost the removal of our ability to practice rationality. He would have been very familiar with Aristotle. The animalization of man. We are losing our ability to choose as individuals and becoming animals, herd animals. So 225, we jump to that, the discipline of suffering. This is, I think, the key to this section we've been given on Nietzsche. Now, last year, they didn't have a question on suffering from memory. In fact, I think the question on Nietzsche, there was a short answer question on Nietzsche, which was to do with his attitude towards other morality systems of the time, such as utilitarianism. And we're going to look at those in a second. So we've done a lot of work on understanding Nietzsche in terms of suffering, and then there wasn't a question on it. It was just one question on an obscure piece of the text. That can happen. You've got to know your texts. It's not going to be enough just to have watched the video or had the classes and read through your notes. You've got to go back and reread the texts in preparation for the exam. You're looking out for what you're looking out for in those, in the rereading, are they obscure little bits that we've probably passed over so quickly, because that might be 1 or 2 marks on the exam. Having said all of that, in writing a good life essay, and if you were using Nietzsche, then you would discuss suffering in more detail. So having a strong grasp of it is really important. Now, before we go ahead, just a warning. That's why I put it in. Warning. Nietzsche is well known for 2 key ideas: the Übermensch, which comes from his book Thus Spake Zarathustra, and the will to power. Neither of these 2 ideas are terms. Neither of these 2 ideas or terms are mentioned in our selection. And we've got to be really careful about how we use them, if we use them at all. They turn up in exam papers every year. Kids have looked up Nietzsche, and the first thing they found is will to power or Übermensch, and they start writing about Nietzsche's Übermensch. In fact, it comes back to us from the examiner's report. Oh my God, how many times did I read about Nietzsche's Übermensch? He never mentions it in this text. So if you're going to make some reference to his will to power or Übermensch, you need to be really clear that it doesn't come from our set of text, and you need to be really precise in the way you're using it. So the closer he comes to discussing them in our selection is his reference to masters, which we're going to look at in a minute. These ideas can lead the reader to see Nietzsche as advocating a form of egoism, similar to Callicles. In fact, it is common to see Nietzsche and Callicles indiscriminately likened, okay, as we've mentioned. And just to really drive this home, this is a mistake. Callicles is a hedonist. He sees pleasure as the key to the good life. In contrast, Nietzsche sees suffering as the key to all human improvement, development, perfection. So, 225, the discipline of suffering. Nietzsche observes that the moral systems of his time, and this was, I think, the exam question from 2018, 2 marks I think it was. Nietzsche observes that the moral systems of his time, hedonism, pessimism, utilitarianism, associated with Jeremy Bentham. I think that's probably the one you would most want to understand and know to be able to refer to if you were writing about Nietzsche. Or even eudaimonism. Well, that's a mouthful. All measure the worth of things according to pleasure and pain, whether this be the pleasure and pain of an individual or of the community. In all of these systems, the aim is to maximize pleasure, whether it's pleasure such as Callicles' hedonistic pleasure, or whether it is Aristotle's eudaimonism, sort of a maximization of well-being, and minimize, or if possible, completely remove pain and suffering. In contrast, Nietzsche sees suffering as a good, insomuch it is through the discipline of suffering that humans are made stronger and improved. Nietzsche was a classicist. He would have known the image of Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the blacksmith god. Or nearly every religious tradition I've studied, every symbolism, every mythology has a blacksmith type god. Why I mention this is the blacksmithing is the perfect image of of perfection through a discipline of suffering. You take the iron ore, which has to be smashed to get rid of the impurities until you're left with just the sort of the raw, crude iron, which then has to be melted down in intense heat. Melted down in intense heat to be purified. And then that purified iron has to be heated and melted out into a mold, and then it is cooled in freezing water, and then taken out and heated and beaten, continuously beaten and to suffer. So it is through this you end up with a strong sword. It's that idea of strength of the sword comes through this process of the metal suffering. So in contrast, Nietzsche sees suffering as a good, insomuch it is through the discipline of suffering that humans are made stronger and improved. And the quote, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Know ye not that it is only through this discipline that it has produced all the elevations of humanity here too." Just stick on suffering for a second. It's not hard to actually find some examples that fit with what he's thinking of. Initially, if I said to you, suffering, good or bad, you ask that question on the street and most people go, bad. But if you're a sports person, you need to train. Your muscles, if you train well enough, your muscles will hurt. They will hurt because they're being stretched and they are being strengthened. And so if you go to the gym and the day after you don't hurt, you might say that you probably didn't do enough work and you haven't actually made any improvement. But if you go to the gym and the day after you're in pain, it's usually a sign that the workout has helped, has done its job. So, yeah, physical activity is an example of suffering that leads to improvement. So you want to always be looking for, throughout all your texts, you want to be looking for pros and cons, arguments for, arguments against. It's clear that there is an example to support Nietzsche. But what about suffering that has no apparent purpose? Think about the cliched examples would be, what about a terminal illness for a child? How does the child improve? They have an illness, they suffer, that's all they ever have in their life, suffering, and then they die. Now, it could be argued, if you want to take that a bit further, that maybe that suffering helps develop, is not about the child, but is about the development of the parents, for example, or the community. Maybe the suffering of the child leads to greater strength in the parents. We see this in many cases where you have children with, say, cancer, and the parents lose the child, and the parents go on a crusade to set up funding, or to attempt to get funding, to raise money, to develop or help develop, to help develop cures for cancer or whatever it might be. And we might argue that the suffering did lead to an improvement in others and theoretically in the community. These parents may, if their child had never suffered, they may have sat at home and been very average people. But because of the suffering they've undergone through the death of their child, they have become righteous people. They've become better, improved. Maybe. What you want to be able to do, if you're writing about this in an exam, is go, look, this is what Nietzsche says. Here's an example of where suffering leads to improvement, physical training, sports training. However, what about cases where suffering has no apparent value? However, maybe in these cases the value can be seen elsewhere, and so on. So what you're doing is you're constantly developing your writing. So it's not just Nietzsche says this, because that's the first level. This is what Nietzsche says. This is what Nietzsche says. This is an example that supports him. However, this is an example that contradicts him. Yet, maybe this example can be seen this way. You can see your answer just growing. Okay. 225 also, the next thing he says is a distinction between creature. You can tell that these talks, they do go on for a while, and I know that you don't have to, you can pause them, you don't have to watch them in like a 2-hour session, but for me, I'm just, and sometimes eventually it all starts to fall apart. Okay, 225, creature and creator. Nietzsche recognizes two fundamental natures in man, creature and creator. If I go back to the analogy or the analogy with smithing before, the creature is the stuff, the creator would be the smith. The creature is the stuff we're made out of. It is this stuff that suffers. It's our body. Our body is the thing that suffers, body, mind. In the process of making, think of the word refining. The herd class, pities the creature. Okay, so we look around at the creatures of the herd. We see that they're suffering and we pity them for this. In part, this arises from a fear that we have. If someone else who is like me can suffer, I can suffer. That leads to a fear of my own suffering, which gives rise to a pity for other people's suffering. Going back to that idea that our fear of our neighbour. So the fear of our neighbour is more than just fear of what our neighbour might do to us. It's fear of our neighbour as an example of what might happen to us. So the herd class pities the creature. They fear the suffering this part of us, creature, must undergo to be perfected or refined. This pity and fear leads to their rejection of suffering. So the herd says we've got to get rid of suffering. However, Nietzsche takes it that the creator part of us is the superior part. The creator needs suffering as a tool with which it can refine the material of the creature. So we'll leave that. It goes to 228. English moral tartuffery. I'm not even certain if that's how that's pronounced. It means hypocrisy. So section 228 finds Nietzsche being sarcastic. There's a bit of a surprise, Nietzsche being sarcastic, about the systems of morality of his time. He describes the moral philosophies of his time as boring and soporific. But he feels that this is actually a good thing, because it stops the general run of people, i.e. the herd, thinking about morality. He doesn't really think that it is the herd's place to be thinking about morality. He doesn't have this sort of view that we can, if the herd all read Nietzsche and learnt from Nietzsche, that we could drag the herd all up to be masters. In this way, he says that these systems have a utility, a usefulness. In particular, he's scathing of the utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, which emphasises the greatest good for the greatest number. Nietzsche dismisses the idea of one morality for all humans because this must mean that the only way it can work is if all humans are brought down to the lowest common denominator. In contrast, he believes that there is an order of rank between man. That's what he thinks. He believes in the hierarchy, the order of rank between man and man and man. Going back to the idea that these systems have a usefulness, their usefulness lies in them being so damn boring that no one really wants to study moral philosophy. If I just want to say one more thing about that, Nietzsche says that moral philosophy if you were truly studying moral philosophy, it should be terrifying. It should challenge you. It should scare you. What is it to be good? What are you? It should cause you suffering. Okay? Utilitarianism is, or the sort of moral philosophy of utilitarianism is, let's work out a way in which we can get rid of all suffering and we'll have the greatest good for the greatest number. It'll all be very, very dull, but we'll have that. From Nietzsche's point of view, moral philosophy, if you are studying it the way he would advocate, should be painful. It should cause you to suffer, to tear away the parts of you that are not up to scratch. Yeah, I'll leave that. 260, master morality and slave morality. Now, section 260, Nietzsche makes a reference to these two phrases, master morality and slave morality. The 2014 to 18 selection, that was last cycle's selection, offers a brief idea of this idea, a brief overview of this idea. So, yeah, the last cycle had, which is the same set of readings that we have. It only gives a really brief overview of what master morality and slave morality mean. But the cycle before that, we had a different selection from Nietzsche. This was the 2009 to 13 selection. And it focused on the idea of the master morality and the slave morality. And I think it's really well worth taking a step backwards to that and getting an understanding of what he means here. I'm not certain if obviously on the film, a hyperlink won't work, but I've included the 2009 to 13 text on our Gen Connect page. It's not a long text, I think it's about 4 pages. I'm going to give you a quick summary here. So the 2019 to 13 selection comes from a work called On the Genealogy of Morality. Genealogy, the family tree of morality, tracing how morality develops, different moralities develop. The 2009-13 selection comes from Nietzsche's book On the Genealogy of Morality. A genealogy is a family tree. This work traces the development of the modern European/Christian morality which Nietzsche found himself living with. Nietzsche offers a historical genealogy referring to specific historical events. For our purpose, it is sufficient to focus on the conceptual development of morality. To that end, he identifies 2 types of people. Masters, the noble man. Okay, that's the one first type. Masters, which he calls the noble man, and slaves. According to Nietzsche, the world is divided into the noble man, masters, and slaves, we might say the herd. Noble morality arises out of saying yes to itself. Slave morality says no on principle to everything that is outside other or non-self. Slave morality first has to have an opposing external worldview. Its action is based on reaction. Okay, so let me just explain that a little bit more. The noble man just simply, in a sense, the ideal noble man, if we go back to that phrase, extra moral, outside of moral, beyond moral, the noble man is extra moral. They simply are. So when you have, if we take morality, we sort of simplify it and go, morality is about choices we make. The noble man doesn't walk up and see a bit of cake and go, do I eat this cake or do I not eat this cake? They either eat it because they want it or they don't eat it because they don't want it. Okay, it wasn't a choice. It's beyond morality. It arises out of simply saying yes to what you feel. I don't want to eat this cake, so I won't eat it. I'm just saying yes to what I feel. I do want this cake, yes, I'll eat it. Okay? Slave morality, on the other hand, rises out of, creates, is based on that other than itself. So it's based on whatever the noble morality, and it is a reaction against noble morality. So if the noble morality says, yes, I can eat, I want this cake, so I'll eat it, the slave morality says, doing what you want is wrong. Whatever you, noble person, whatever you say yes to, I'm going to say, no, that's wrong. Whatever you say no to, I'm going to say, yes, that's right. That's what we should be doing. You said you're not going to do it, and I'm going to set up a rule and say, but it ought to be done. So Nietzsche says that the slave revolt occurs when resentment, now this is a really tricky term, resentment, it's not just resentment. It comes across as resentment, but there's a couple of very good articles on it. You want to look it up to have a deeper understanding of, if you want to understand Nietzsche. But when resentment gives birth to values. So resentment is a sense of hostility directed at that which one identifies as the cause of one's frustration. Okay, that is when you assign blame for one's frustration. Resentment is not to be considered interchangeable with the English word resentment, or even the French word ressentiment. While the normal words both speak to a feeling of frustration directed at a perceived source, neither speaks of the special relationship between a sense of inferiority and the creation. So resentment gives birth to values. It creates morality. I feel frustrated. I feel frustrated at my own weakness. So my weakness comes from I'm weak in comparison to your strength. So I'm going to not blame my weakness. I'll blame your strength, and I'll create a set of laws, a morality that says strength is evil. So slave moralities or slave values are based on rejection of noble actions. So it's a reaction against the masters. Men of resentment will inevitably end up cleverer. This is really interesting. Than. One second. Cleverer than. Will inevitably end up cleverer than the noble race, and therefore they will respect cleverness. This may seem to sound contradictory. The slaves have to think about what is right and what's wrong. The nobles don't. They just do it. They don't even know why they do it. It's innate. They don't have to think about things. They don't have to construct a system of morality. They are like the proud lion, just doing what the lion does. Whereas the slaves are like the cunning hyena. Anyone who actually knows anything about hyenas would reject this, but I'm sort of suddenly off on a little bit of a Lion King sort of. Now, sorry, I mentioned Lion King, and now all I can start thinking about is Scar singing his song, you know. A shiny new era is tiptoeing nearer. Sorry, that's the cartoon, not the new one. Anyway, men of resentment will inevitably end up cleverer than the noble race, and they will respect cleverness. They define weakness as freedom, hence as good. So 260, master morality and slave morality. Back to section 260 and master morality and slave morality. This is what he actually says in our text. Nietzsche notes that these can exist even within one's soul. Now this is really interesting. The previous text I was talking about from the previous cycle looks at the slave revolt as a historical drama. But here in this text, in section 260, what Nietzsche's doing is looking at the individual soul and recognizing that we can have both master morality and slave morality, both master and slave within the one soul. It's the idea that every one of us is both masculine and feminine. So all of you, it's a girls' school, but you all have a masculine element and a feminine element. This shows that his concern is less about social structures in where we're talking, and it's more about the existential nature of the individual. Here Nietzsche returns to the idea we alluded to earlier about the nature of morality as envisaged by the rulers, the masters. When the rulers determine the concept of good, okay, so for rulers, what they would classify as good, it is this: the exalted, proud states of soul, which is considered distinguishing and determining the rank of the order of rank. It should be noted at once that this first type of morality, so if you're taking notes, you're going to first of all say there's master morality. Now, I am aware that we have said earlier that master morality is, in a sense, extra moral, i.e. beyond morality, that there is no such thing for the master as morality. There is no codified system of morality, of good and bad. Having said that, Nietzsche then goes on to say you've got what we call the master morality and slave morality. So he's going, we've got the way in which the masters understand good and bad, even though he's earlier said that it is extra moral. Okay? So it should be noted that in this first type of morality, master morality, the antithesis good and bad means practically the same as noble and despicable. So for the master, there are things that are noble and there are things that are despicable. They're not going to talk about that's good and that's bad, that's noble, that's despicable. The antithesis, so the pairing, good, evil, originates elsewhere. They don't have a sense of something being evil. Evil is a moral word. This goes back to the idea that for these masters, they don't really have a sense of morality. They don't have a codified language in their head of good and evil. So good and evil are moral terms. And even though he's talking about master morality, masters don't really have moral terms. They have the terms noble and despicable. Noble would be strength. Despicable might be cowardness. So the noble man creates value. It is immediately obvious that designations, so these are all quotes, that's why they're in this colour. It is immediately obvious that designations moral value, designations, I think that should say designations of moral value, I'm just missing an of there. It is immediately obvious that designations of moral value were everywhere first applied to human beings and only later and derivatively to actions. What he means here is that initially the master would look at the world and see the world in terms of themselves and say, that is honourable, that is, or he is honourable, he is despicable. He is good, he is bad. Later this turns to that is good, that is bad. Why this is later is because that refers to doing that is good, doing that is bad, i.e. you should do that, you shouldn't do that. So initially, moral language starts off from the master's point of view with humans, and then only later becomes applicable with slaves and herd values, becomes applicable to actions. The noble man, type of man regards himself as the determiner of values. He does not need to be approved of. He judges what harms me is harmful in itself. Everything he knows to be part of himself, he honours. So from this point of view, such a morality is effectively self-glorification. That may seem a little bit like a sort of egoism, the egoism that we perceive with Callicles, but I think you've got to be really careful here. What the master, the noble person, values is that which is honourable in themselves, their strength. What they disapproves of is that which harms that which is honourable in themselves. So here it gets tricky, because if strength is honourable, cowardness would be despicable. So my being cowardness would be despicable. Strength doesn't mean, or weakness doesn't mean being weak to other people. It means being weak in and of myself. So if I saw people suffering, well, if I saw, I don't want to use the word suffering, I don't want to confuse you with suffering. I'm going to hold this conversation till we're in class and just go through this a little bit again. But everything he knows to be part of himself, he honours. Such a morality is self-glorification. The noble human being, too, aids the unfortunate, but not, almost not, from pity, but more from an urge begotten of superfluidity of power. So here's, I was trying to avoid the word suffering. This is better to talk about aiding the unfortunate. So the noble person might aid the unfortunate, might aid someone's not got enough food, they might give them charity. But they don't give them charity because they pity them. They give them charity because of their own superabundance, superfluidity, that's the word he uses, their superabundance of power. They see their own ability to help others as a way of self-glorification. This may sound again like, well, they're only helping others for their own good, and yeah, maybe that's exactly what they are. They're doing it because they are full of their ability, but it doesn't come from pity for the other person. So 260 refers to this type of person as the man of power. Nietzsche's idea of the man of power might seem to suggest Callicles' elite. Oops, you know what that should have? Given that it is Callicles' idea, it needs a possessive. So the phrase, the man of power, might seem to suggest Callicles' elite, but a closer reading reveals that it's exactly the opposite. This is Nietzsche. The noble human being honours in himself the man of power, also the man who has power over himself. Very much like what Socrates said when he said that asked Callicles, should rulers rule over themselves? Should they have self-discipline? Let's go back. The noble human being honours in himself the man of power, also the man who has power over himself, who understands how to speak and how to keep silent, who enjoys practicing severity and harshness upon himself, and feels reverence for all that is severe and harsh. Feels reverence for all that causes suffering, because suffering brings development and improvement. According to Nietzsche, it is the powerful who know how to honour, and therefore will have reverence for age and tradition. There's another really important point. Actually, it wouldn't surprise me to see this turn up as an exam question either. The idea of, how does Nietzsche and Callicles perceive age and tradition? Callicles, if you remember, attacks Socrates ad hominem, a long ad hominem attack on Socrates and Socrates' tradition of philosophy. And he attacks him, calling him old man. He has no reverence for Socrates. And Socrates, of course, just destroys him. But from Nietzsche's point of view, the man of power will actually have reverence for that which has gone before, because they'll see in that reflections of their own power. The morality of these rulers. The morality of the rulers is based on this principle, that one has duties towards one's equals, and that towards beings of a lower rank, towards everything that is alien, one may act as one wishes, or as the heart dictates. This doesn't mean that you take from people of lower rank or weaker things just because you can, in a Calliclean type way. It just means that you act as you wish, and that might mean that you are charitable to them, or that you help them. But you don't help them because of pity for them, or because you want to be seen to be helping them. You help them possibly just because you can, and it's what you are at that moment. No one would question it, because you are a master. You are just doing what you want, what you are. And if you don't help them, so be it as well. That's also the right way to act. So this is the morality of rulers, that one has duties only towards one's equals. That towards beings of a lower rank, towards everything that is alien, one may act as one wishes, or as the heart dictates, and in any case, beyond good and evil. Act beyond good and evil. Act in a way that is beyond morality. You don't do it because of a system of morality. You do it because of what you are. While this sounds egotistic and harsh to modern ears, from Nietzsche's point of view, it was only in this way that genuine pity can arise. And the word pity, we should really, it's worth looking at the roots of the word pity to understand what he's thinking of. 260, the morality of slaves. So slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. Here is the source of the famous antithesis, good and evil. Okay? Usefulness. It is good because it's good for the whole, the herd. It is evil because it's bad for the herd. With the slave's way of thinking, the good man has in any event, what? With the slave's way of thinking, the good man has in any even to be a harmless man. I wish I had the Nietzsche text right in front of me right now so I could actually look that quote up. I might have to leave you to look that quote up because I can't quite read. I've obviously missed a letter. With the slave's way of thinking, the good man has in any, I'm going to suggest that it's probably in any event, to be a harmless man. If I'm wrong, we can fix it later. Wherever slave morality comes to predominate, language exhibits a tendency to bring the words good and stupid closer to each other. Yeah, I'm with that. Looking at the way the world's going at the moment. Finally, in 260, the final thing he mentions, Nietzsche recognizes what he takes to be virtues, what the noble virtues are. Courage, insight, not cleverness, insight into your true nature. Cleverness, if you remember, he sees as a sign of the slave or development of the slave mentality. They have to invent things. Insight is just knowing what you are. Sympathy. Again, that's a really interesting one. Sympathy. Sympathy arises out of understanding. There's an element where we might, the two words that we often get confused are empathy and sympathy. Possibly this word, he uses the word sympathy in the text, we might think of empathy as a better way of understanding. Empathy is to understand another as yourself, to empathize. And the noble would empathize with another noble, with an equal. They will identify with an equal. Sympathy would arise for those which are more unfortunate, but not pity. Pity he sees as a sort of a negative term. And the other one is solitude. The man of power, the master, the noble person, is not trying to become the leader of the polis, not trying to become the ruler and take over. They are concerned with the development, the improvement of themselves, hence insight. They are concerned with their perfection as man. And this comes through solitude. In many ways, courage, insight, sympathy, solitude, the man of power that Nietzsche speaks of sounds more and more like a Christian monk gone off in the desert. The courage, insight, sympathy, and solitude, these sound like the virtues of Christ in the desert during his 40 days of temptation. So there we go. Nietzsche is often disliked by Christians and for his avowedly anti-religious writings. But I think a lot of these writings are actually anti the hypocrisy of the modern version of Christianity, in so much as it is a herd religion. And that's Nietzsche.